I am going to move on to a couple of other things about Monte Carlo methods, which is actually not there in the book, right. So Ramanathan, we need to add the UC trees paper to the Moodle page, right. Bandit based Monte Carlo planning. What's so amusing about it? Okay. So there is a technique which people have used. People who typically talk about Monte Carlo methods use something called rollouts. Okay, so the idea behind rollouts is the following. So I have a heuristic way of selecting actions. I am trying to solve a problem. So I have some heuristic way of selecting actions. Okay. So what do I do is, when I come to a particular state, right. So I use the heuristic, right, and select actions and run multiple trials from there, right. So I use whatever heuristic I have, I select, I run multiple trials. So what is this? The heuristic, you can think of it like a policy, right. Policy is what? A mapping from states to action, right. I am not talking about value functions or anything, just a policy. I use the policy, I run several trajectories, like just like we talk about in the Monte Carlo case, and then what I do here is evaluate all the different outcomes that came from running that particular heuristic, right, and then I pick the action, right, that gives me the best possible expected outcome. If that didn't make sense, let us try it again. Okay, if you have a deterministic heuristic, then what you should do is probably select actions probabilistically at the beginning and then run your heuristic. Okay, so I start from some state, let us say I pick action A1 and then let us say I can pick action A2. There are two actions that I can pick, right. My heuristic will suggest something. Well, let us say I pick action A1 first and then I run my policy pi, and likewise I pick action A2 or run my policy pi. Okay. Then I take the average value I get here, I take the average value I get here, then I take the action whichever gives me the better average value, right. So this might not be the action given by pi, or it might be the action given by pi, we do not know, right. So all I am saying is, given any policy pi, I can do a rollout version of this. Okay, what is the nice thing about doing this rollout version? I am guaranteeing you that whatever policy you execute by virtue of doing rollouts on pi, right, will be at least as good as pi and quite often better than pi. If pi is not optimal, right, then this rollout execution of the policy pi will be better than pi.
So what do you mean by rollout?
This rollout is just I am generating multiple trajectories using pi, right. It is like rolling out the policies. No?
Isn't this some kind of Q of A?
It is something like Q of A, right, but this predates all of these things, right. So this kind of rollout idea of execution, right, this is nothing to do with first of all, this is nothing to do with MDPs, right. So it could be any kind of games that you are playing, it could be adversarial setting, it could be anything, right. I talked nothing about value functions, right. I talked nothing about returns, nothing else, it predates all of that. Okay, this is in fact it is called rollout execution of a policy. Okay, rollout execution, the pi could come from any heuristic, right. It did not have any notion of optimality associated with it. So what the rollout execution gives you is, whatever be the performance of pi that we had earlier, I can better it if it is betterable. Okay, if I do not get a better policy than that, with a very high likelihood pi is optimal. Why think about it, it is very much like doing one step of policy improvement, right. I have done one step of policy improvement over pi, if you think about it, right. So what did I do here? This is essentially an evaluation of pi, right. I did an evaluation of pi specific for starting from one step after S, right. So I just did a policy evaluation of pi and I was greedy with respect to that policy evaluation. So this is called rollout execution.
Follow pi till we reach the goal state.
Yeah, it's follow pi till you reach the goal state. Yeah.
How many iterations should I run from A1?
This depends. Now I want you to tell me what it depends on.
In the UCT, the these were the arms, and you run from the root to the, in each iteration you run from the root to the leaves. That is, you are picking at one arm at each time step. And
Yeah.
in the each of the interior nodes, you have that upper bound term that you maximize.
You are confusing too many things, but yeah, go on. Yeah.
Yeah, so there was nothing called, we follow at one time step, we follow one, that means 1 pi till we reach the loop. You
Yeah.
are saying that here we are following many,
We are solving only one pi,
no,
but we are doing many trajectories.
yeah, there it was following one trajectory.
Yeah.
At each time step we are following one.
Yeah, so we will come to that, right? I have not yet talked to you about UC trees. Just ask me questions on what I have taught you so far.
This is the UC tree.
This is not a UC tree. This is just rollouts. I am just talking to you about rollouts. I have not started talking to you about UC trees. Okay. Your question was how many times should I run those trajectories?
The more you run, the better average you have.
Of course, but how much? How much? Anyone wants to tell me what it depends on? Yeah, indirectly.
Number of different trajectories suggested by pi.
Exactly. So closer. So it depends on the variability in the system, right? If the system is deterministic and pi is deterministic, one trajectory is enough, right? If the system is very stochastic, I mean all kinds of random things are happening, then you probably need to run a lot of trajectories. Or if pi itself has a very stochastic policy, you will have to run a lot of trajectories. Okay. So it depends on the variability in the sampling process. If the variance in the samples you draw is very small, it's sufficient to run a small number of times. Okay. Is there any other factor that will determine this? Huh?
Trajectory length.
Trajectory length. Why should trajectory length be a determining factor?
Indirectly affects the variable.
Indirectly affects variability. No, then not about the variability. Trajectory length can be a factor in another way. Yeah? Computation, right? So how much computation time do you have to spare between every decision? It's a very practical consideration, and you have to actually be cognizant of it, right? So the length will affect the variability, but also affects the amount of computation that you have to do. So the longer the trajectories are, the fewer that you can generate. Ironically, the longer the trajectories are, the more you want to generate, because it increases the variability. But you will have to do the opposite. So is there any way of cutting down variability here?
Some heuristic terminal cost.
Exactly. So don't go all the way to the end, right? Stop somewhere in between, depending on how much time you have, how much computation you can spare for this, and how much variability is there in the system. Okay. So if you can find a good heuristic that tells you how much more it is going to cost if I run till the end, right, you can use that heuristic as the terminal cost. Right. Remember when we talked about why we call value iteration dynamic programming, I said you can think of the value as the terminal cost, right? So we have one step problem and then we have a terminal cost. Like that, here you will have a many step problem and you will have a terminal cost. Right. So what should be the terminal cost? What is the natural terminal cost for us to use? It's a value function. Right. So if you have an estimate of the value function, you can use that as the terminal cost. See, so far I did not talk about the need for a value function. Right. I can do rollouts just given a policy. I don't need a value function, but the reason for using a value function with rollouts is if the trajectories are very long, the variability is very high. Right. So the longer the trajectories, the smaller the number of samples you can take. Therefore, it is going to be very self-defeating, because the larger the variability, you want to take more samples. So to kind of get around that, people started using estimates of value functions. Okay. So once you have value function estimate, you can start doing something cleverer. Okay. Good. So this is a state of affairs when rollouts was like a kind of a peripheral thing in the RL community for a while, right? In fact, when I started teaching this course, I used to give a handout from a dynamic programming book on rollouts, because it was not covered in the RL textbook. So I used to take a Xerox of well, this was before every textbook ever printed became freely available on the internet. So I used to give a photocopy of the few pages that discuss rollout policies, right? I gave it out to the class to read about rollout policies and things like that. And then things changed dramatically when, my God, I thought his name was harder to pronounce. Well, Chaba and another Hungarian with a hard to pronounce name came up with something called upper confidence trees, UC trees. Okay, so UC trees at the heart use a rollout like idea, right, but they also use the notion of value functions and upper confidence bounds that we saw from bandits. They use the notion of upper confidence bound bandits, UCB 1 specifically. They use the idea from UCB 1. If you remember, I told you there are many variations to UCB. They use the idea, very simple one, the UCB one, and then married with what they called Monte Carlo tree search. So I am going to explain Monte Carlo tree search first, and then I will tell you what they did to get UCTs, and it turns out to be one of the most powerful planning algorithms that people use in the literature. Okay, I should explain what I meant by planning here, because it is very unique to Rich Sutton. So Rich introduced this difference between learning and planning into the community. So learning is when you try to solve an MDP without knowing any of the parameters. Right, it's online, right, it's completely sample driven and so on and so forth. While planning is when you have some kind of specification of a model, right, and you use the model somehow to solve your problem. So all of these Monte Carlo methods, if you use a sample model, remember we talked about sample models and full models, right. So if you use a simulation model or a sample model, it comes under the regime of planning because you are using a model. Okay. So whatever we talked about can either be planning or a learning algorithm depending on how you draw your samples. Okay. If you draw your samples from a real system, then it becomes a learning algorithm. If you are drawing your samples from a simulation model, then it becomes a planning algorithm, right. But there are other methods that use the model more integrally in their method as opposed to whatever we have spoken about so far. So there are many Monte Carlo planning methods. So we will talk about Monte Carlo tree search. Right. Let me see if I can. My God, I really need to get my glasses. So I am really sorry, my handwriting seems to be much worse than usual today, but let's put it down to variability in the system. So you have to go and read the paper to get a better estimate. So essentially I have just written one subroutine of this, right. So this is a search function I am writing, right. It's a function called search. Okay, it starts at some state and some depth at which it's going to be called at, right. So I have some kind of a depth to which I will search, right, some depth to which I will search, and I start by checking if this is a terminal state. Okay, if it is terminal state, I just return a reward of 0 in the simple case, but I will return the terminal reward. So whatever is the terminal reward, right. So in this case all the terminal rewards are 0, we are assuming that all the terminal rewards are 0, otherwise I will return whatever is the reward, okay. And then I check if I have reached the required depth, right. So if this say something is a leaf state, that means it is a state at which I will not do any further processing, right. Then I evaluate whatever that state is, whatever is the value of the state, I will return that value. This is like the terminal cost that we spoke about, right. If I stop here, I will use the value of the state as the terminal cost, right. So we will evaluate that state somehow and we will return the value, okay. So what is next? Okay, now it is not a leaf state, okay, it is not a terminal state, so that means we are somewhere here. So we are not here, we are not here, so that means we are somewhere here, right. Right, so somewhere there, what do? I select an action, right. So how do I select an action? Huh? Sorry? Based on the? Yeah, the heuristic function. So whatever was the original heuristic function given to me, I will select an action based on that heuristic function, right. I will select an action based on the heuristic function, then I will take one step, I will simulate the trajectory. So that is essentially what I am doing here, I simulate the trajectory, right. I find what the next state is, I also find what is the reward I get for taking that action. What is that?
Why are we simulating?
Well, if you can actually behave in the real world, go ahead and behave in the real world, but how are you going to reset you back to that thing and generate another trajectory, right? So if you want to do something like this, you better have a simulation model, right. So if this is the whole idea behind rollouts, so you need to have a simulation model. Okay, that's a point I missed out, but you need to have a simulation model, kind of obvious, right. I mean, otherwise how am I going to generate multiple trajectories starting from here? If it is a real world, then I will have to roll my robot back there and then say okay, run again, okay, then catch it and then put it back there and say run again and so on and so forth. That is not going to work, right. Is it? Or imagine playing games, right. Yeah, it's like playing with a kid, right. So the kid plays some moves and say no, I want to take that back after 4 moves. So it will be like that, right. Anyway, so you do the next state and you get the reward based on your simulation model, and then what do? You take your return, right, you initialize it with the reward, right, and then what do? Gamma times search from the next stage. Essentially you are going to trace the entire path until you reach a terminal state. Once you reach a terminal state, you keep popping back all the rewards that you get, not a terminal state. Once you reach either a leaf state, which means you have reached the depth at which you are going to cut off, or you have reached the terminal state, right. What you do at that point is you keep passing the rewards back up the calling stack, right. So this is like a recursive call, I keep popping the reward back up. So this summation, when it finally finishes computing, will have the return, the complete return, or the kind of an adjusted return. Why I am saying adjusted return? Because if I come to the stopping condition here, I will use some kind of a value function estimate or some evaluation that I have. So it is like a corrected return or a truncated return. So I will have that as my G, right. And then what I do, I update the value of the state and action, right. I say this is the value of the state and that is the action you took, and that is the total return, and this is the depth at which the action was taken from that state, okay. So why is the depth important here? Huh?
That may be terminal right.
What's that?
Right.
Huh?
That may be terminal.
No, if it's terminal thing, I won't even reach there, right? If the state is a terminal state, I return 0 at the very top. I won't even reach the update condition.
That I have moved through from that action.
Yeah.
I need to update all of them. For that, I need the depth.
Why do you, how will the depth give you how many states you moved through?
And I have moved that far down.
Okay. And why do I need that? So it turns out that you are not even making any Markovian assumptions here. So the so closer I am to the end, right? So the value function will be different, right? If I have five more steps to go, or if I have only seen 5 steps, I have a longer direction to go, right? So I will need to maintain the distinction in the value function, right? So I am still not come to UC trees, by the way.
So can you explain that again?
I told you about this, right? So when we have a fixed horizon, when I say this, the world is going to stop at time t equal to 10 or something like that, right? So if you are one step away from that, you will behave in a different way. If you are 100 steps away from that, you will behave in a different way. So I am just giving you the number of steps that have gone, so that if you want to specialize your value function based on the number of steps that you have taken, you could do so. Okay, but there is another reason for carrying the depth around, but before we get to that, okay, before I talk about upper confidence bounds and stuff like that, so the Monte Carlo tree search algorithm, okay, would require you to carry the depth around only for that, otherwise you can throw away the depth in the update, right? So you need the depth here, so you can throw away the depth in the update if you are assuming everything is completely Markov, okay. Yeah.
Why do we need depth in select action if we have Markov?
Because it does not matter wherever you are in the system, right?
We
So
don't need depth.
you don't need depth in that case. Yeah, that's what I am saying.
Even in the select action.
Even in the
Select action.
yeah, but only in the previous one you need
Only
left leaf. Yeah, yeah, fine. So this is fine. So when you call this, you call it with your initial state and the depth of 0. Right. So here when you call it with s and a depth of 0. Okay, and you could call this multiple times from that. Right, so every time you call it, it will traverse one trajectory and it will give you one return corresponding to that, right? Right. So every time you call this, it will give you a return corresponding to that, and then you can choose your best action based on the returns that you are getting from there. Okay, is it clear? Right, so from here you will run this multiple times, right, and you take the returns again and again, and from there you choose your best action.
Should we call it after the first action is taken? We call it
Yeah, it is not specified.
Is it?
we should call the search function.
Yeah, like I told you, right, it depends on how you choose the actions. If your policy has sufficient exploration, then you are fine. Right, if your policy has sufficient exploration, you are fine. If your policy does not have sufficient exploration, then it becomes an issue, right? And how will you choose the best action? Anyway, huh?
Maximum return.
Whichever next state gives you the maximum. So basically you will simulate each action once, okay, and then see which are the next states you land up in. Whichever next state gives you the highest value, you pick that action and you go, okay, once or multiple times. You can always, if you remember how you select actions using the value function, right, you have to remember what we covered earlier. So I said how to recover a policy given a value function, given how to behave greedily with respect to a value function, not a q function, v function. So you could do that, or you could modify this whole thing to give you q functions instead of v functions. How will you modify this to give you q? Okay, great. So this is the basic structure of what is called as Monte Carlo tree search, okay. And depending on how you select actions, right, so you can get different kinds of algorithms out of it, and the most popular one is called UC trees, right, where the select action is going to use a upper confidence bound like formulation. So I am going to look at the expected reward for taking an action plus a term for the confidence bound, right. So what is that term going to depend on? Number of times you have pulled the term. Anything else, Shubha?
There is a constant factor.
Yeah.
Constant factor depends on how much exploration you want.
Yeah, so there is a one magic constant that comes in there, okay, which is what they needed to actually help them prove some results, okay, and they had some bound on that magic constant. Sorry, I forget what that bound was. Do you remember what the bound was? Yeah, so there is a bound on that magic constant. Essentially, it is exactly like your UC bandits, right? The expression will all be the same, except that instead of just having root of
2 ln t by n, there is something.
no, so instead of having 2 ln t by, right? That used to be the constant that you add, right? So here what you do is instead of that, you have some magic constant Cp times root of ln t by n. Okay. So when you select action, so instead of selecting actions randomly or according to a fixed pi, so what you do is you look at the current estimated value function for each action, add Cp root ln t by n, okay, where Cp is the constant that is going to depend on the problem that you are solving. Okay, so the higher the variability in the system, the larger the Cp has to be, right, because you want to explore more, right. The higher the variability in the system, the larger the Cp will be, okay. This is something you typically end up determining empirically, but there is some bound on how large you have to search and so on and so forth, right. I can get you that numbers later, but you do this Cp into root ln t by n plus the q value, right, and then you select actions according to that, right, and then go back and pick your best action. Okay. So what does this buy you? Huh?
More efficient exploration.
In what way?
The number of steps to converge to optimal formation.
So you have your explore exploit problem here, right? So you need to explore many different actions in this action selection space, so that when you go back and select your best action, you have selected every action often enough, right? But you don't want to keep exploring all the time, because when you go back you will not have, you would have wasted too many samples. Suppose I give you like 1,000 samples that you can take, you would like to explore the more promising actions more than the obviously hopeless actions. So if you do some kind of uniform exploration, you are going to split your budget too much, right, across all of these things. So doing UCT like exploration gives you a much more focused learning, right. So just like we have in the UCB case, this gives you a much more focused learning, okay. And this was one very elegant way of converting a bandit solution for solving the full RL problem, right. The only caveat here is you need a simulation model. You need a simulation model to be able to do this, right. If you have a simulation model, you can do UCT style planning, and it turns out that in many cases you can come up with some kind of a rough simulation model, okay, and you can get away with it. And so it turns out now it's become one of the very popular solution methods, and in many robotic situation where you have a simulator, it turns out to be a very robust planning algorithm, right, and a lot of roboticists now like to use UC trees in their approaches, okay. Any questions on this? So I will be putting up the paper for you to read. I will not say that the paper is easy to read. Okay, so most of unlike his lectures, most of Chaba's writings are a little hard to penetrate. So how many of you watched Chaba's lecture? One. Linear bandits. I told you to go see a video on linear bandits, right? It's linked from the Moodle page. You are not sure? It's in Moodle. All the RA lectures are there, is it? Yeah, okay. Those are the 3 classes that Chaba took, right? So you should see it. Not enough to just see the link. You have to go watch the video. So many people are telling me 3 links are there, and when you ask, have you seen the video? Only one hand goes up. Did you see the video or did you see Chaba? You are not here when the RARL happened. You didn't understand anything. Okay, you were here when the workshop happened. Yeah.
Yes.
You are going to say something?
We had a live demo.
Yes, sir. Live demo. You had a live demo.
That time I didn't understand anything.
Yeah. Anyways, hopefully you will understand a lot more now, and yeah, please do see that. So, any questions on this? You see trees? Yeah.
In this work with continuous action spaces.
If you can come up with the parameterized representation for the value function, okay, that is well behaved in the action dimension, then it will work. So we will come to that aspect of it later later in the thing where I talk about using this kind of parameterized representations. But since you asked, I am telling you that it will work if you have a parameterized representation. So when you do this update value, right? So essentially you have to update an actual set of parameters that represent the function, just like we talked about in reinforce, right, where we update the policy parameters. You need a value function parameterized like that, and then you can get it to work. And a little bit more conditions on the well behavedness of the value function.
Sort of bounds on the action state. So how in UC trees you add something sort of a bonus and then you calculate the value. How do you do that?
Oh, in the continuous action space, is it? Good question. So we'll have to think about that. So that is the thing I have, right? So this n is essentially the number of times I have basically taken action. So that's basically my depth kind of thing, and oh yeah, n is your depth. So that's the reason you need to pass depth everywhere, right? And ln t is the number of times you have taken that action. Huh?
Total number of pulls.
Total number of?
N is the total number of pulls.
Yeah, that's what it is, right? The depth would be the total number of pulls. Yeah, ln t is the number of times you have taken that particular action, right? So that that will be n. Oh, n is the number of times you have taken the action. Sorry. T is the total number of pulls. So t will be the depth. You're right. So I have to keep track of n. How many times I have taken the action so far, right? So one possibility is to say that I am going to do this in a parameterized version, but we'll have to see whether that will work or not. You're right. So yeah. So without the exploration bonus, this will work in the continuous action space. For this, we'll have to figure out how to make it work. Okay. Fine. All set. Okay. We can move on to the next topic. So this is the end of chapter 5. Right, so we are starting chapter 6, but chapter 5 in the second edition of the book has one additional section. Okay, so where they talk about some of the recent work primarily being done by Rich Sutton and his group on trying to reduce variance in Monte Carlo sampling. Right. So one thing which they talk about is when you really have long trajectories, right, but you have a small discount factor, like say gamma is like 0.3 or something. So the contribution in the return of the subsequent terms is going to die down very quickly, right. So you really don't need to maintain this full product, right. You could get away with doing something that is truncated, right. When I am looking at the Pxi by Qxi, right, like I don't have to do the whole product, I can do something truncated. So how do you do that in a principled manner? and give some kind of guarantees about convergence and stuff like that. Right? He gives a very high level quick discussion about that in the last section in the chapter in the book. Right? So again, you can read it for information. Right? Well, that means I will not ask questions on it in the exam. Right? That's what it means. If you want to know what it translates to. But there are other things which I asked you to read, which I didn't say are for information. So those are fair game.